Do you remember the COVID pandemic? It was a huge thing for all of us, but a couple of years later, it's rather faded into history. We don't think so much about it anymore. But it was maybe the one of the few times in human history in the world was faced with a common threat, and we all, at least most of us, pulled together. There was a feeling of being united against a common threat. It was an awful time for many, many individuals, but there was at the same time, at least in the most frightening early stage of the pandemic, there was a wonderful flowering of humanity, of compassion and generosity that helped see us through. It didn't last long, though. Cynics say it was an aberration, that human nature doesn't change. Look at all the history of our human race. Isn't it filled with countless wars, genocides, cruelty, greed? Not to mention our squandering of natural resources. The sort of spirit of compassion and togetherness we saw during that pandemic could only ever be a brief interlude, the cynics would say, in the normal grisly course of human history. On this view, our society will always remain fundamentally flawed, notwithstanding all our material progress. We're driven by self-interest and our uncontrollable selfish desires, they say. We're trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. And civilization is just a thin veneer which constantly bends and warps and cracks. Well, that's the widely held cynical view. And it certainly is widely held. Most people take a jaundiced view of the world. Lack of confidence and trust in society is a common factor. You can see it over and over again, and lots of evidence about it in the International Trust Barometer, published every year by the US firm Edelman. It shows that less than half the people in most countries trust their country's institutions to do what's right. And another big international survey done over the last 20 years or so by Barrett Values shows that the overwhelming majority of people in all the 30 or more countries surveyed, covering very different cultures, different levels of economic wealth, but the majority of people in all those countries believe they're living in a society characterized by crime, by violence, by conflict, by corruption. They believe that most people act from mostly selfish motives and that the institutions of our society actively encourage such selfishness. Well, the cynics say we're just being realistic. But are they right? The answer lies in the deeply flawed way we perceive other people. This survey by Barrett Values, backed up by other research, also asks the same people in those countries about their own values and the values of the people around them, the people in their immediate neighborhood and community, and their perception was completely different. When they spoke about their own personal values, they typically use words such as caring, honesty, compassion, respect, trust. When they talked about their experience of their immediate communities they lived in, they talked about helpfulness, about friendship, the sense of community there was. In other words, when they had direct experience, they saw a completely different world from the one that they knew only indirectly through media, rumor, gossip. In this strange, almost schizophrenic world that most of us seem to live in, we appear to ourselves to be living on little islands of decency and unselfishness, surrounded by an ocean of brutal selfishness. Well, there's something odd going on here, isn't there? It doesn't make sense. People say they have, or maybe they at least claim to have, lovely positive values such as compassion, honesty, respect and trust, and yet they seem to live in a society which is dark and violent and selfish and greedy. So either they're not putting their personal values into action, or the picture they have of their own society is far, far too negative. Well, actually, I believe both propositions are true. We don't put our values into action much of the time. I think all of us have that strong suspicion about ourselves. We're not putting our values into action most of the time, and we have a strong tendency to see the worst in others, especially people we don't know. And this discourages us from acting unselfishly ourselves. It's a vicious circle. Our negative view of other people's motivations results in a general distrust of social institutions and a result, therefore, to engage positively with society. So embedded in us is this negative view of human nature that even when we see other people performing altruistic acts, we tend to attribute their behavior to selfish motives. This, in fact, was the conclusion of a series of studies done a few years ago by a team of American psychologists over a period of time, and they looked at altruistic actions. They got the group of people to look at altruistic actions like helping elderly or homeless people, and the participants in the study viewed these actions as being done with essentially selfish motives. That was the spin they put on it. In the final study, the participants read about philanthropists who had been featured in the news with great acts of generosity. So they spent time looking at these acts of generosity and considering why the philanthropists did what they did, and became ever more cynical about the motives of the philanthropists. They were so used to thinking cynically about other people's motivations that they couldn't be convinced by any evidence to the contrary. But are we really so selfish, or is there something else at work here? The cynics will say, oh, there's so much hard evidence that the human race is basically selfish and cruel. What about all those wars and genocides, cruelty and the greed mentioned earlier? The history is full of it. And we see it all the time on TV, in the newspapers, on our social media feeds. Yes, of course. Yes, of course. It's true that history is full of wars. It's full of greed and cruel and selfish acts. And as the cynics say, it's drilled into us every day by television, newspapers, and movies, and by books, and by the internet. Our minds constantly are being invaded by negative news and views. It's not that it's untrue, but it just doesn't give us the true and the full picture. The impression we get is that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, to use that ancient phrase. But what we underestimate is what a distorted view this media avalanche gives us of how the vast majority of people live their lives and what motivates them. The reality is that over the last few decades, we've seen global poverty, child mortality, famine, crime, accidental deaths, all fall precipitously. To take one example, the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty has halved over the past 20 or 30 years. This is an extraordinary success story, and you might assume that everyone would know about it, but how many people actually do know about it? Well, research shows it's only 7% of the population know about all this wonderful news. Less than 1 in 10. So why do we have such an unbalanced view of the world around us? It's not all down to modern media. There's some other things going on here too. We have, for instance, an inbuilt bias towards negativity, stemming from our days as vulnerable hunter-gatherers out on the broad savannah, keeping a sharp lookout for danger. We're more tuned in to spotting potentially bad things, spotting threats to us, than we are in spotting good things. If you've got a bad thing on the horizon, a predator or whatever, you have to act very quickly. Those are built into us as our priorities. And a wealth of recent psychology studies has shown that negativity bias still fundamentally distorts the way we perceive each other and what happens to us. Then there's something called availability bias. If we can easily recall instances of something, we assume it must be common. So we're bombarded daily with horrific stories about aircraft disasters, child snatchers, beheadings, and these tend to lodge in the memory and skew our view of the world. We all also have a strong tendency to project our own feelings of negativity about ourselves onto others. Traditional psychology, from Freud and Jung onwards, has shown us how we protect ourselves from these unconscious feelings we have of inadequacy, of guilt, of fear, anger with others, and so on, by attributing them to other people. They are the problem, not me. Those others can be individuals, perhaps someone who reminds us of our mother or father or whatever, or even more dangerously, they can be groups of others that we project upon. And sadly, terrible things are happening somewhere in the world most of the time. But the reality for the vast majority of us is that we mostly live our lives quietly and perhaps even boringly among generally nice, kind people. And we're generally living longer and healthier lives than we ever had before in human history. Only this isn't very newsworthy. And this has a terrible effect on our willingness to fully engage in society. When we believe that the world around us is rotten and devoid of compassionate values, we naturally hold back from expressing our own kindness and compassion to others, particularly to people we don't know. Instead, we tell each other that, oh, most people are out for themselves, and just reinforcing the message from the media. Our apathy and alienation from society is therefore just compounded. So will this tide of cynicism ever turn? Are we doomed to forget about the wonderful things that people do for other people all the time with no expectation of any reward or recognition? Not just during bad times, during a pandemic or whatever, but every day, every moment of every day, everywhere. Maybe the tide hasn't turned just yet, but once we become aware of it, we can start turning it around. By changing the way we behave and engage, we can change the way other people see the world. Perceptions can change unexpectedly fast, especially when they're based on wrong assumptions. Major cultural shifts are happening all the time. In our own lifetime, we've seen many of them, and the speed of these shifts is accelerating all the time. Modern neuroscience confirms the truth of the old saying, what we pay attention to grows. If we can put our best values, our unselfish, compassionate values, consistently into action in our lives, those neuroplastic brains that we have will gradually be rewired, and our negativity will begin to wither away. So let's hang on to the genuine warmth and compassion that we do experience from each other through life, and remember all those kind things that we do for others and others do for us. And that happens all the time. Let's just remember that, and let's not be shy about putting our own values into action and giving a lead to others. The power of example, the ripple effect, can be very powerful. Let's believe in other people and trust them wherever we can. Let's take on the cynics and tell them that the world isn't rotten. Let's spread the word about those wonderful life-enhancing values, all the caring, the honesty, the compassion, the respect, the trust, and all the other good values that we all, in fact, actually share. Let's turn this around and build hope for the future, for a better world. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Today at the World Speech Day, I'm very thankful to Simon Gibson to invite me to talk about this, to give a small talk that I feel which is important for people to know, and I wish to spread this word. I want to talk today about the responsibility of freedom of speech in the era of misinformation. So, ladies and gentlemen, freedom of speech is a fundamental right, one that allows us to express our thoughts, challenge ideas, and shape the world that we live in. But freedom of speech does not mean freedom from responsibility. Speech must be embedded in truth and supported by scientific evidence to be meaningful and constructive. Today, in the era of fake identities, misinformation, and fabricated narratives spread faster than the facts, we find ourselves constantly working on debunk falsehoods, intellectual time, precious time, that should be spent advancing knowledge is wasted. It is wasted in dismantling lies instead of building progress. Do you see the real danger in this? There is a real danger. The misinformation itself becomes part of our understanding, creating confusion rather than clarity. The misinformed mind is often more dangerous than an uninformed one. False narratives, where repeated enough, gain credibility and shape decisions in ways that can be harmful to individuals, societies, and even global governance. Science, research, and critical thinking must be at the foundation of our discussions, ensuring that the speech contributes to progress rather than distortion. So let us defend freedom of speech, not as a shield for falsehoods, but as a tool for truth. Let us use our voices to inform, not to mislead, not to build or hate, or not to destroy. Because in the end, the power of speech is not just in speaking, but in speaking responsibly. So thank you for listening to me.